By 1956, Tony "Ducks" Corallo was a captain running his own crew for the Lucchese family and had achieved an omnipotent presence in labor unions and the garment industry. John J. O'Rourke was the chief local lieutenant of Jimmy Hoffa and the president of the Local 282 in New York. O'Rourke was a hand-picked choice of Hoffa's to gain election of the Joint Council 16, which was comprised of 58 locals and 125,000 members and considered the most powerful Teamster position in New York. O'Rourke ran against the presiding council president Martin Lacey, and on February 14, 1956, O'Rourke defeated Lacey and was elected to a 4-year term as president. But the legitimacy of O'Rourke's victory quickly came into question. The following month, in March of 1956, a corruption-crusading journalist named Victor Riesel published an article in his syndicated column for the New York World Telegram and Sun entitled "Mystery Hoodlum Grabs at Teamster Reins," with the subheading reading, "Partner of ex-con Dio heads mobster drive." Riesel wrote that Tony "Ducks" Corallo is fast emerging as one of the most powerful underworld figures in the field of labor. Riesel's column caused a tremendous amount of unwanted exposure to both Corallo and Dio, and they now had a real problem on their hands. Soon after the release of Riesel's column, Johnny Dio and some of his associates orchestrated a plot to send a loud message to Riesel and hired a man named Abraham Telvey to carry it out. On April 5th, 1956, at around 3 a.m., Riesel was leaving Lindy's restaurant in Midtown Manhattan when Telvey approached him and threw a cup of sulfuric acid in his face. Riesel was rushed to the hospital where doctors tried to save his eyesight, but Riesel would wind up being completely blind for the rest of his life. After the attack on Riesel, law enforcement scrutiny into labor union corruption vastly increased. A federal court placed a temporary injunction preventing John O'Rourke from taking the presidency of the Joint Council 16. Authorities had connected Abraham Telvey to the Riesel attack. Telvey was originally paid $1,175 to carry it out, but after he demanded that Johnny Dio pay him an additional $50,000, in July of 1956, Telvey was silenced with a bullet to the back of his head. However, several people would later be charged for the attack on Riesel, including Johnny Dio, although the charges against him would later be dropped. On August 15, 1957, John O'Rourke was called to testify before a Senate panel investigating improper activities in labor management known as the McClellan Committee. The panel included Massachusetts Senator John F. Kennedy and his younger brother Robert F. Kennedy, who was chief counsel. Tony Corallo was also called to testify, but invoked his Fifth Amendment on every question.
You also known as Duck Corallo?
I refuse to answer on the grounds of made intent to
You
criminate.
got any business?
I refuse to answer on the grounds of intent to criminate.
You have any profession?
I refuse to answer on the grounds of made
You
intent
have
to
any
criminate.
occupation?
Johnny Dio also invoked his Fifth Amendment.
Are you acquainted with Mr. John J. O'Rourke?
I respectfully decline to answer the question upon the ground that the answer may tend to incriminate me.
As did Local 239 President Samuel Goldstein. The committee alleged that Corallo, Dio, and Goldstein rigged the election for O'Rourke in a scheme to enhance Jimmy Hoffa's power on the East Coast. Witnesses listened to wiretapped conversations of Corallo and Goldstein, which not only connected Corallo to Jimmy Hoffa, but also captured Corallo discussing the potential of a $10,000 payout to Martin Lacey for him to withdraw as a candidate of the Joint Council 16 presidency. One observer at the hearing spoke of Corallo's side-eyed, deadpan stare that made him uneasy whenever he made eye contact with him. A few weeks later, Jimmy Hoffa was also called to testify.
This argument I know for it, your testimony here this afternoon.
But there is no question about Hoffa, and don't you say that either.
In October of 1957, Jimmy Hoffa was elected president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, yet another election marred by corruption. By now, Johnny Dio was a capo in the Lucchese family and a power broker with influence in many unions, and Dio was one of Jimmy Hoffa's key supporters in his quest for the IBT presidency.
Dio had set up 7 New York City paper locals, which, as the name suggests, is a local which only exists on paper. It may have a few or no members and could be used as a means of extortion by threatening to unionize an employer's workers unless it receives a payoff. It could even list workers at a work site as being members of the local and masks extortion payments as union dues, when in fact no employees have consented to any involvement with the local and aren't receiving any union benefits. Dio gave several of these paper locals to Hoffa, which allowed him to control the important Joint Council 16 of New York and secure the presidency. He then appointed John O'Rourke as his vice president.
Jimmy Hoffa had sold his soul to organized crime and was now in debt to men like Johnny Dio and Tony Corallo. From here on out, Hoffa would be closely tied to mobsters and be a central figure in labor union corruption.
Now that their inside man was president of the Teamsters, the Mafia's influence in IBT translated into tremendous status, power, and wealth. Having influence in the IBT provided organized crime with leverage over tens of thousands of businesses which were dependent on truck deliveries. They could exercise that leverage through solicitation of bribes, extortion, demands for no-show jobs, and threats of strikes. Then there's what's known as sweetheart deals, which is an agreement between a union and an employer in which a union official softens their demands in exchange for a kickback. The arrangement is often favorable to the employer and is usually executed without the participation or approval of union members. Furthermore, the Teamsters were comprised of over 1.5 million members around the country. With the organization's voting power, union officials could get politicians elected into office by supporting their candidacy. With their influence over so many businesses vital to the economy, as well as having politicians to do their bidding, the men who exerted control over labor unions, like Tony Corallo, exerted a level of control over the entire country.
Another powerful labor leader and criminal companion to Jimmy Hoffa was Tony Provenzano, known as Tony Pro. Tony Pro was a captain in the Luciano family, which had since become the Genovese family, and was the president of the Teamsters Local 560 in Union City, New Jersey, which was comprised of 13,000 members. The Luccheses were also heavily involved in drug trafficking and had some major dealers in the family, such as Joseph Di Palermo, known as Joe Beck, who was one of the top heroin kingpins in the world, as well as Matthew Matty Madonna, Carmine Tramunti, and John Ormento. The Lucchese family worked alongside a major drug crew operating out of Pleasant Avenue in East Harlem, known as the Purple Gang. Due to his associations with known drug dealers, Tony Ducks was also considered to be a top narcotics figure in the country, even though there was no indication that he himself had anything to do with narcotics since the 1940s. Authorities viewed Corallo to be an intelligent man who had the network and means to excel in various avenues in organized crime, and he still made the FBI's top hoodlums list. By now, Carmine Mr. Gribbs Tramunti was acting as Corallo's bodyguard.
In December of 1957, Johnny Dio was convicted of extortion for shaking down 2 stationery firms, and the following month he was sentenced to 15 to 30 years and began serving his sentence at Sing Sing State Prison. In September of 1958, Corallo resigned from his position as VP of the Local 239 and gave no reason, although he still ran it from behind the scenes through what's known as dummy officials, who were merely frontmen. Along with the Local 239, which had also absorbed the Local 995, Corallo still exerted influence over numerous other locals, including the Local 138 and the Local 405.
He also had heavy involvement in New York's Garment Center and influence over the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. In June of 1959, Johnny Dio's extortion conviction was overturned and he was released from prison, but was immediately charged with federal tax evasion. By the late 1950s, some members of American organized crime were turning to gambling in England as an ideal investment. Slot machines had been legalized there and it had potential for a lucrative venture. In 1959, Corallo, Charles Duke, Vincent Belmonte, and Louis Foreman got involved with selling slots to gambling houses in London. Duke and Foreman traveled to England and set up a British corporation in London named Machinery Imports Limited. They purchased 1,000 slot machines from Mills Bell-O-Matic Corporation in Nevada for $375 each, then shipped them to London and resold them to gaming houses for $675 each.
The two men spent the next year in England organizing the sale of jukeboxes, coin machines, and slot machines for Corallo. Around that time, Corallo traveled to London to meet with his partners and scout some club locations.
One of the people who Corallo allegedly met with in London was Charlie Cray, the older brother of the Cray twins, Reginald and Ronnie Cray, who were influential crime figures in the London underworld.
However, British authorities had become well aware of American mobsters' activities, and in 1960 they asked Foreman and Duke to leave England, to which they complied.
In 1960, Robert Kennedy wrote a semi-autobiographical book named The Enemy Within, in which he discussed the McClellan hearings and the various mobsters connected to them. In the book, Kennedy said that an employer had told him that he hired Tony Corallo to go into his place of business every 2 weeks just to glare at his employees, and that was enough to keep them in line. Congressional investigator Carmine Bellino said that Corallo was the meanest, toughest gangster he had ever seen. On April 29, 1960, Johnny Dio was convicted of his tax evasion charge and was sentenced to 4 years in prison. Tony Ducks would now be the mob's top figure in labor unions.
In the late summer of 1960, Tony Ducks met a woman who became his mistress for a short time. Their activities mainly took place at Howard Johnson restaurants, a motel on Long Island, and drive-in movie theaters. The woman was later questioned by investigators and said she knew nothing about his employment or associates and knew him as Tony Franco. After a few months of seeing her, Tony told her that he was going on a long trip and she never heard from him again. That long trip was because Corallo was going into hiding. He knew he was the subject of another investigation and was going to be subpoenaed again to testify, so he left the city in order to avoid being served. He laid low in a concealed hideout and his whereabouts were unknown. However, shortly after he went to hiding, authorities located him, staying at a home in Centerport, Long Island, and served him his subpoena. On January 13, 1961, Corallo was called to appear before the McClellan Committee again. He was accused of taking money out of Teamster union funds of the Local 239, and investigators produced canceled checks totaling almost $70,000 in payouts to 4 of his criminal associates. After Corallo's second appearance at the McClellan Committee, an informant claimed that Corallo had lost a great amount of prestige in the underworld. The reason for this was twofold. First was the fact that New York State Police had located him shortly after he moved into what he considered to be a well-concealed hideout. Second was the fact that Tony Ducks had embraced his nickname and often bragged about his ability to stay one step ahead of law enforcement agencies. But when investigators testified at the committee about his conversations and activities, as well as connecting him to the payouts, it was extremely embarrassing to him.
On January 20th, 1961, John F. Kennedy became president and appointed his brother Robert as U.S. Attorney General. Robert Kennedy made the prosecution of IBT President Jimmy Hoffa a top priority, and he expanded the Department of Justice's Organized Crime and Racketeering section with an intense focus on labor racketeering.
Corallo had sold his previous home in Whitestone and moved to a nearby house in the same neighborhood on 144th Place. The unassuming and private Corallo had described himself as a loner who knew a lot of people but had no intimate relationships. A neighbor described him as very unfriendly and not bothering with anyone in the neighborhood, and had rejected her invites for him and his wife to join gatherings at her home. He rarely spoke in public, but was often immaculately dressed in tailor-made black suits with gold cufflinks.
The quiet menace Tony Ducks Corallo was a serious man who was all about business and making money. He had become very wealthy from numerous rackets, had stakes in businesses both legal and illegal, and had invested considerable money in the stock market. Corallo claimed to authorities that he was self-employed as a fruit salesman.
On June 1st, 1961, the FBI planted a bug inside a wall at the office of the local 138, and over the next year it captured numerous incriminating conversations between Corallo and several others.
In December of 1961, a federal jury indicted Tony Corallo for conspiring to fix a fraudulent federal court bankruptcy case. Indicted along with him were Justice Vincent Keogh, former Assistant U.S. Attorney Elliot Kahaner, and jukebox dealer Sanford Moore. Corallo had bribed Keogh and Kahaner with a payment of $35,000 to obtain suspended sentences for 3 of Corallo's associates who were involved in coin-operated music and game machines.
In June of 1962, Corallo, Keogh, and Kahaner were found guilty, and Corallo was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison. He began his 2-year prison sentence at Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania on November 7, 1963. Johnny Dio was released from prison in 1963 and looked to regain his prominence in labor unions, although he continued to be marred by legal issues. In July of 1964, Jimmy Hoffa's corruption had caught up with him, and he was convicted of various charges and was facing 13 years in prison. Corallo was released from prison on May 7, 1965, and went right back to business as usual.
By 1966, boss Tommy Lucchese was in very poor health and was diagnosed with a brain tumor. Due to his imminent death, the family had been planning his next successor. Although Corallo was said to be Lucchese's top choice, other forerunners for the job included James Jimmy Doyle Plumeri, Carmine Tramunti, and longtime family consigliere 68-year-old Vincent Rayo. The Lucchese family continued to operate with efficiency and pulled in huge earnings from an array of rackets. A few of the many top earners for the family included Captain Paul Vario and associate Jimmy the Gent Burke, who brought in big profits from cargo heists at the JFK airport.
The Mafia also had a big stake in gay nightclubs around New York City, and Corallo was working on a deal to purchase a gay nightclub named Lion's Third on 256 East 49th Street. Corallo and Philly Falco backed the money to purchase Lion's Third, and in February of 1966, the club name was changed to the Mystique Private Club. The club attracted wealthy individuals in the New York City area, and on average, 1,000 gays frequented the club per week. The club offered members legal aid if any of them were arrested on homosexual charges.
Among the people seen frequenting the Mystique Club to carry out meetings included the mayor of New York City, John Lindsay, and the former police commissioner, Stephen Kennedy.
In August of 1966, an FBI informant stated that some friction had occurred between Tony Corallo and his partner, Carmine Mr. Gribbs Tramunti. Gribbs had brought up a gripe to the commission governing body of the Mafia. The commission mediates conflicts and must be consulted with before the murder of any made members. Gribbs had complained that Corallo ordered a hit which wasn't sanctioned by the family. As a result of this, Corallo was called before the commission to explain himself, and subsequently he was demoted from capo to soldier for overstepping his authority in ordering the unsanctioned hit.
The following month, on September 22, 1966, a meeting was held at La Stella restaurant in Queens, in which 13 top mobsters from around the country were in attendance. The meeting was raided by law enforcement and all 13 men were arrested.
The topics of this meeting included discussing Tommy Lucchese's next successor, as well as how Lucchese's interests in the Caribbean and Florida would be divided amongst the families. Corallo wasn't in attendance at this meeting, and he stated to an informant that he wasn't there because the meeting largely revolved around him being appointed Lucchese's successor. After the Stella meeting, an informant claimed that he heard the leadership of the family was one of dual authority between Carmine Tramunti and longtime consigliere Vinny Rayo, and that Corallo's demotion to soldier allegedly hurt his consideration as boss. However, Corallo would allegedly tell that same informant that he was now considered the leader of the family.
Dux was connected to many men in high places, including Herbert Itkin, a powerful labor lawyer who became his business companion. Henry Freed, a wealthy contractor who was the president of S&T Grand, a general contracting company which employed several of Corallo's criminal cohorts as officials. And a close aide to Mayor John Lindsay named James Marcus, who was recently appointed as the city's water commissioner.
Dux would carry out business matters at establishments all over New York City. Some of the places he frequented included Tony's Italian Restaurant on West 59th Street, the Bruce Ho Restaurant on 57th Street, and Club 140 on 140 West 44th Street, which was owned by his partner Philly Falco and his brother James Falco. Corallo frequented the Bruce Ho Restaurant almost every day to meet with Philly Falco to collect Shylock loans and discuss business matters.
Beginning in June of 1966 through mid-1967, Corallo made 21 trips outside of the country, most of which were to countries in the Caribbean, mainly the Dominican Republic. Joining him on many of those trips to consult on business matters was lawyer Herbert Itkin. In January of 1967, Corallo and Itkin were refused entry into England and ordered to return to the U.S.
Corallo also had business interests in Florida and was looking to purchase a nightclub on Biscayne Boulevard in Miami named the 4200 Club. During his frequent trips to Florida, he would visit his old associate, Lucchese capo Eddie Coco, who was recently released from prison after serving over 10 years for his murder conviction. Coco was another one of the men being considered for the leadership of the Lucchese family. After Jimmy Hoffa exhausted his appeals, he began serving a 13-year sentence at Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in March of 1967. Johnny Dio was also given another prison term, and in December of 1967, he was sentenced to 5 years for bankruptcy fraud. Boss Tommy Lucchese died on July 13, 1967. While Corallo was alleged to be his top choice as the next boss of the family, following his death, there appears to have been a period of deliberation about who his official successor would be.
In December of 1967, Tony Dux, Water Commissioner James Marcus, lawyer Herbert Itkin, union official Daniel Moto, and contractor Henry Freed were all indicted for bribery. James Marcus gave an $800,000 reservoir cleaning contract to Freed's company, S&T Grand, without any competitive bids, and accepted a $40,000 kickback from Corallo and Freed. Corallo was released on $10,000 bail. This would become a huge scandal in New York, and former Tammany Hall leader Carmine DeSapio was implicated as well. It was also revealed that Herbert Itkin was playing both sides and had been an informant for the FBI and CIA for the previous 5 years. In January of 1968, a plot to kill Itkin was uncovered, and he was placed in protective custody. He was expected to testify in 50 federal cases.
Due to Corallo's legal issues, it's alleged that Eddie Coco was given the title of acting boss, but it quickly became an issue that he was on lifetime parole in Florida and couldn't travel outside of the state. The commission then appointed Carmine Tramunti as the interim boss of the Lucchese family. Whatever Corallo's exact title was at this point, he was undoubtedly considered one of the top men in the leadership panel of the Lucchese family since Tommy Lucchese passed away. In June of 1968, Corallo, Freed, and Moto were convicted of bribery charges, and in December of 1969, Corallo was convicted of another bribery charge. Corallo was free on bail pending appeals, but surrendered himself on December 29, 1969, to commence a 3-year sentence, but was also waiting to be sentenced on his second bribery charge. Corallo was given a total of 4.5 years and began serving his sentence on May 1, 1970, at Atlanta Federal Penitentiary.
After Corallo went to prison, Carmine Tramunti was recognized as the acting boss of the Lucchese family. During the next few years while Corallo was incarcerated, James Plumeri was killed. Vincent Rayo retired. And in September of 1973, Carmine Tramunti was sentenced to 3 years for contempt. Then the following month, he was indicted for his involvement in a major heroin ring. Corallo was released from prison in 1973. Then the following year, in May of 1974, Tramunti was sentenced to 15 years for his narcotics charge. It was now Corallo's time to run the show. After more than 40 years of involvement with the family since the 1920s under Gaetano Reina, Tony Ducks Corallo had reached the top of the hierarchy and was now the boss of the Lucchese family.